Welcome to this episode of World's Most Interesting Pilots. I'm your host, René Banglesdorf, and I am kicking off today with someone who I consider a true Renaissance man. Andrew Gratton is here to talk to us about the Citation CJ3. Andrew, thank you so much for joining me. I can't wait to delve into your story. But first, we're going to get started talking about what makes the CJ3 such a great airplane. Welcome.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thanks, Renee. Thanks for having me on your show.
Well, great. So let's get right into the CJ3. How long have you been flying it, and how did you get to that path, that particular airplane?
I've been flying the CJ3 and the CJ series from CJ1 up to the 3. And the different plus variations of those aircraft. I've been flying them for about 5 years now. I've been flying mostly up in Europe with the airplane and developed some good experience on the type. And I got there by flying, like everybody else, I was bush pilot in Africa, flying small single engine piston aircraft, and finally moved my way up through the turboprops and then ended up on some of the jets.
Well, we're going to get into that story a little bit later. What makes the CJ3 different from other planes? Like, what do you think is the standout feature of this model?
I'll talk about it now a little bit from the pilot's point of view, but I think what it makes it stand out is that it's such a high performance airplane and it's capable of doing a lot. It's quite fast. It's got a good range for the type. And because of the redundancy that Cessna has built into all of these types, you can fly the aircraft single crew. So I think that that's what's quite unique, is that you get a lot of airplane, a high performance airplane, but you can still fly it quite capably on your own.
That's fantastic. And there are quite a few owner pilots who fly this type of airplane for that very reason. I think that makes it a great airplane. You talked about a little bit about the simplicity of the aircraft, being able to fly it on your own. Is it quirky at all? Is there anything unique about the CJ3 that's different from any other type of aircraft that you've flown?
I would love to tell you that there's some quirkiness, but there's not really. Once again, the way that Cessna has built the airplane, there's a lot of redundancy. So the aircraft itself, it's a straight wing airplane, very easy to fly. It handles very harmoniously. All of the systems, the CJ3 has got FADEC for the engine, so it makes it really, really efficient and really easy to operate. And then the avionics suite is just really wonderful. So, there's not really much you can mess up in that airplane or any quirks that are going to come up to bite you. So no, I think it's a very well-rounded airplane.
So on that note, let's talk about dispatch reliability. What have you experienced with that?
Actually, I'm a great fan of specifically the CJ3, because we were talking about it the other day that one of the aircraft that I fly now has a dispatch rate of over 95%. So that's in an EASA commercial environment. It's even saying that we're not dispatching on the MEL all that often. It's a very reliable aircraft.
Okay, well, let's switch to costs. I mean, we've established it's consistent, it's reliable. Talk to me about costs. Are the direct operating costs right what Cessna says they are, or have you found them a little lower, a little higher? What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's kind of tough, because you're looking at, how could I say, an APAC environment versus a European environment. Traditionally, what you're seeing is that the costs are a little higher here in Europe. I think that's based on the manpower, the fuel, and so forth. So you find that the operating costs are not mirroring what one would expect in America. So that is slightly different. I think that you would probably see between 15 and 20% increase in those costs here in Europe.
Okay. And what about the maintenance costs? Are they pretty predictable if you go according to the maintenance schedule, or have you seen a spike or a dip in those according to what you were expecting?
Yeah, look, this aircraft is a really popular aircraft in flying in the charter taxi environment. So the aircraft have all seen a lot of hours, so they got experience behind what one can expect. And then the specific airplane that I'm flying now is on a parts program. So with that in place, you're really safeguarding yourself, and everything becomes quite predictable with that in play. But even if you're just following a SESCOM, you can see the intervals coming, and you can generally safeguard yourself that you have control of those costs that are coming.
So in addition to being a pilot, you're also an aircraft broker, you're the owner of a software company. I gave a hint about you being a Renaissance man. So I'm going to ask you to put your broker hat on just for a second. What do you recommend for people in Europe who are purchasing CJ3s about being on a parts program, being on an avionics program, or being on an engine program? How important is that in the European environment?
I'm a firm believer in those programs. That being said, often you're operating these aircraft in a chartered environment. So if you, for instance, have an engine change that has come up, you're going to get a loaner engine quite easily. The parts are more readily available. And then, of course, the higher costs here, you really want to make sure that you have that in your budget and so forth. So I think that, how can I say, these parts programs, although they're costly, you definitely get your money's worth. So I would promote both parts per hour and avionics programs as well as the engines.
It does make it a lot more predictable, which is a benefit for owners who need to have a budget. I usually recommend them as well. So switching back to your pilot hat, let's talk about fuel burn. What does that look like in the plane? Is it consistent as you're approaching altitude? And when you're at altitude, what are you seeing there?
That's very predictable. I mean, these Williams engines, they're extremely efficient. We're generally seeing about 800 pounds per hour fuel flow at altitude. And we're generally cruising in the early 40s, between 400 and 450. And you'll see around 800 pounds per hour. So that's quite low for that aircraft. That's
great. That makes it very attractive. So let's talk about, since they've been flying so much in a charter environment in Europe, let's talk about chronic maintenance issues. Are there any? Are there things that you see pop up over and over again, or things that you've heard from other aircraft in the fleet that maybe are alarming or, need someone to pay particular attention to them?
Well, once again, I'm a huge Cessna fan. They really have worked it all out. They've seen everything there is to be seen almost. And so they've geared their aircraft for that. And a case in point, we had a generator issue with the aircraft a little while back. And when I investigated a little further, I saw that it was only a few hours away from TBO, that generator. And it's not really a common issue either. The only thing that I do have an issue with the Citations in terms of maintenance or any kind of issues is that they're highly prone to corrosion.
I was going to ask you that if you didn't admit it.
Yeah. So, I mean, you can see it, a lot of the sheet work. I mean, most Cessnas you're gonna encounter corrosion. And in specific, once again, referencing to some of those parts programs, landing gear, you can see a lot of corrosion pitting in those landing gear. I mean, you've experienced that selling these aircraft for all of your experience. So yeah, that's often something that we know is going to come up.
Right. And in my experience, the corrosion issues on Citation aircraft are worse in Europe. Is that your experience as well?
I would tend to agree, and you probably notice that because they're often operated at the coastlines, and and you have obviously all the snow and that kind of environment to deal with out here. So
yeah, a little bit more corrosive environment. So definitely something to watch for, no matter where you're buying a CJ3 or other Cessna product, is the corrosion, especially in the landing gear.
Exactly.
So okay, so switching a little bit to the customer experience here, something near and dear to my heart, and probably your wife's as well, is luggage capacity.
There again, I'm pretty happy with what you got in the CJ3. You've got quite a nice area in the nose cone, which is accessible from each side, so you can fit all sorts of things in there. We carry cutlery and a lot of the cleaning equipment for the aircraft in the nose. And then in the rear of the aircraft, you've got quite a large baggage compartment. And something that I really like, especially this time of the year, is that there's an elongated compartment at the back of the baggage compartment where you can fit in skis.
Of course.
There's quite a lot of them. So yeah, it's quite versatile. I really enjoy the baggage compartment. Yeah.
So you can take everyone's skis that fits in the cabin.
I would go so far as to say that, yes.
Okay. Fair enough. I'm going to hold you to that.
Yeah, sure. You're welcome.
You'll have to bring mine separately. So let's talk about the passenger experience in the cabin. Have you flown with every seat full?
Yes, I have.
And what do the passengers say about that? What's their experience?
Because you're filling each seat, you're going to decrease the range of the airplane. So ultimately, when you have got all the seats filled, it's generally not for a long period of time. So
that's true.
So that's that. And of course, when you're filling all seats, somebody's going to have to be sitting on the lavatory.
Hopefully a kid.
Yeah, exactly. And that's obviously not the best possible experience. But ultimately, all of the chairs in the main compartment swivel and slide out into the aisle. And that allows for a lot more comfortable space. So generally speaking, people are quite happy with it, knowing that when they do fill the cabin, it will be a little tighter, but it's doable and it's still comfortable.
That's great. What's the city pair that you fly most often, or that's the most popular for a CJ3?
Given the environment that I work in, there's not a lot of city pairings because we're flying to different destinations all the time. We're seeing a lot of flights out towards London. So we're flying a pairing of Stockholm to London quite often, and as well down to Germany, to Berlin area. So we're doing that sector a lot too.
And how many hours are those flights typically?
Well, typically you could do London in around 2 hours or so. So
okay.
It's you're cruising at around 0.73 for the most part. So it's a good speed and relatively okay flight time over there.
Fantastic. What's the longest trip you've flown in the CJ3? And it could have had stops. Like where's the farthest you've taken it?
Oh, sure. I think that the longest, if I can just direct towards one of the longest legs that I've done on the airplane, has been Stockholm to Alanya in Turkey. And that was just over 4 hours. And the airplane did it quite comfortably with all the EASA IFR reserves. So around 4 hours. But, sometimes we're flying clients who have a certain theme to their trips. So they're visiting a lot of cities. So, we can fly our max FDP during the day very easily.
Fantastic. Well, I know that you really enjoy flying the CJ3 and that you've flown other CJ models as well. What do you see as the biggest differences between you've flown the straight CJ and the CJ1 and the CJ2 and the 1 Plus and the 2 Plus? The 3 obviously hits a sweet spot, but what are some of the strengths of the CJ3 against the earlier models in the CJ line?
The power.
Okay.
Yeah, downright the power. Once you're sitting in the cockpit, there's not a lot of difference, especially if you're in the Pro Line series on the avionics. You're not going to see a lot of difference, but it's very noticeable in the power. Even just jumping from the CJ2 to the CJ3, you will notice that difference. which means that you can more often than not go straight to your cruising altitude, for instance. That's a main difference in the CJ3.
That was a great answer.